All right, Dr. Romi, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for joining me here this morning. I'm really excited for our conversation today. But before we get started, I want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself, please.
Thank you, Furkan. And firstly, just to say thank you so much for having me here today. I really value and enjoy your work, so it's a real pleasure to be able to join you today. So a little bit about myself. I trained as a clinical psychologist in the UK, and my clinical specialism, I guess, traditionally would have been called eating disorders. And that's predominantly what I've been doing. A little bit, probably 70% of my work has been focused on that.
Mhm.
But I guess what I would say is in recent years, probably the last 5 to 8 years, my work has focused much more broadly on the relationship that we have with food, eating, in our body in a general sense. So for everyone, not just from like a clinical perspective of when things perhaps aren't going well.
Mhm.
And my personal interest in it is really looking at how this relationship, how we relate to food and to eating and to our body can actually be a gateway into all aspects of our life. And when we really explore it, we can use it both as a means to inform us and to learn about ourselves, but certainly also as a way to transform and to work with food, eating, and our body, and use that as a tool to then transform all different areas of our life.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you for sharing that. And you're currently based in California, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct. Currently based in California, but I get this is the million-dollar question. People always say, "Well, are you there for good?" And the answer is, who knows? I definitely moved around. We were living in Costa Rica for a little while, in Mexico. So my work is pretty global. I'm online predominantly only. So I'm always based in different places, but right now from California.
Amazing, amazing. So you just like to be in the warm places, which is smart, considering
That's
where I
correct.
am. But what drew you to eating disorders and specifically from the onset? Like, is there something that you were passionate about, and if you don't mind sharing, and why was that?
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to share. And I think it's important to add in a sort of a very real kind of well, I think within the eating disorder world, what you find is that a lot of the professionals that go into this, they themselves have struggled with an eating disorder, and they have a sort of personal investment in it. And what I would say is, whilst I grew up in London, in northwest London, there was definitely my own relationship with food and eating in my body for sure. But I think not to the extent that would ever have been classified as an eating disorder. And so my entry in actually came from quite a position of naivety. And initially, it was from this place of, yeah, I don't always look in the mirror and love the way that I look, but what would lead to someone to actually starve themselves or to throw up after eating? And so it was really initially, and it's not like this anymore, but it was very much this place of separation, actually, of like, oh, it's I have my experience of this, but there are those people out there that are doing something different, and I really want to understand that, and I'm intrigued by that.
Mhm.
And so I think that, as I say, it was quite a naive way of looking at it. But that was kind of what got me interested, is sort of understanding the differences between the way that I related to it and how I was seeing other people relating to food, eating in their body, and the things that they were doing as a result of that.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, and one of the things that I wanted to explore too was around the same context. When I did a course where we did talk about eating disorders, and what really jumped out to me is quite often we don't even know if we have an eating disorder. And the reason why I say that is personally too, as I was doing the research, I realized that hey, maybe sometimes I binge eat too, and I really had to look inward and understand the circumstances when I would do that. And it made me realize my relationship with food. And quite often we get caught in these cycles. I find personally that was my experience, and I could see that with other people too. Is you'll kind of be healthy and mindful what you're eating, and then all of a sudden you have these moments where you're binging. So I thought that was pretty fascinating, and someone, I like to consider myself that I'm fairly aware of things that are happening in my life, but not having that level of awareness, I guess, was a little bit surprising.
Absolutely. I mean, I'd love if that's okay to share what the
Yeah.
defining, what the moment, the changing moment for me really was. And there might be people out here that are listening and think that this really wasn't a big deal, but this absolutely just completely threw my entire life into a different course and way of thinking about things. And so, as I mentioned, I had this fascination with eating disorders and this separateness. And I had gone out to Boston. I was working at a lab in Harvard, actually doing research on suicide and self harm. And even then, the kind of angle that I took, I was most interested in how eating disorders could be used as a form of self harm. Um, but it was still definitely from this place of separateness. And anyway, so I was walking back one day with she's one of my closest friends now, but she was a colleague of mine working in the lab. And we were walking through Harvard Square. And anyone who knows that, there's a few, but there's an ice cream shop there that is quite famous. And it was quite a cool evening. And I'm talking to my friend, and she says, "Oh, can we just stop for a minute? Do you mind? I really want to go in and get an ice cream." So I said, "Sure, no problem." So we walk in, and I remember it so clearly because I literally remember what she ordered. She ordered a raspberry and mint swirl ice cream, but she didn't get like a cone or like a small cup. She ordered like a big, like a tub, you
Yeah.
know? So I thought that was kind of interesting. And we go out. So she gets her tub, she pays, we go out, and she takes the spoon. And right there and then, she rips open the top and she takes one huge mouthful of this ice cream. And oh, yummy, this is so good. And then takes another one. And then she puts the top back on and puts it away. And I'm watching all of this, and I think this is quite, for me, this was quite strange. So I
Yeah.
sort of said, "Well, that's it? That's all you're going to have?" And she said one sentence that, like I said, this changed the course of my life, actually. She said, "Yeah, I just, I eat what I want and I stop when I've had enough."
Mm.
And it was in that moment that it was as if someone had held a mirror up to me. And like you described, not having that awareness, I was like, like, I had never even thought about, especially with ice cream, like, what does that mean when I've had enough?
Mm.
Surely there are rules around these things. And I mean, ice cream isn't really my thing, but chocolate bars, I would eat the chocolate bar, and when it was finished, I'd try not to eat any more of it. And if I did, then that would be bad. And if I resisted, that would be good. And so my whole construct around my relationship to food and eating, despite the fact that I've been working in and exploring this for some time, it was called into question, because
Yeah.
I started to realize, like, gosh, I'm really not looking at myself. Yeah, I might not have what would be classified as a diagnosis, and it might not be as extreme, but I have all these rules, and I have behaviors, and I have times when I think I'm being good and bad, and everything was just thrown into place from that one comment. And it really I mean, from then onwards, I basically, the next few years, this was before I did my doctorate, and the next few years was me in watching people eat and seeing how they explore food and eating and how they make those decisions. And
Yeah.
that sort of kick-started everything. So but yes, absolutely, not having that initial awareness, and then turning everything into that awareness of, like, wow, I really want to understand this.
Yeah. Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. And I agree. That was kind of, for me, it was like, oh, okay, maybe I need to explore this a bit more and understand what's going on. What are the reasons? When does this happen? Right? You start kind of putting the patterns together. It's very important, I think, at least, and interesting too. But what are some reasons people do have that struggle with food? And I think a lot of people have an interesting relationship with food, but what are some of the reasons that that happens?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think everyone in the eating disorder world who really is researching and working with people, there's a generic understanding that ultimately it's really not about the food or the eating or even the body image. So we start from there, and it, I wouldn't want to sort of pigeonhole an entire world of people into this one category, but I think most, the most underlying kind of rawness, the core beliefs that will be around shame and guilt and a lack of self-worth. And that's what it's, I'm sort of just jumping straight to the end there. That's ultimately what it's going to come down to. That being said, I've worked with plenty of people where the presentation is purely coming out from a food eating, a disordered eating way. That's not always the case. There's lots of comorbidity, so you can also see substance misuse and relationship difficulties. But sometimes I do see it in quite a, I would say, a pure form. And then just with some intervention around, how to learn how to listen to your body and respond to it and develop that awareness, you see huge shifts elsewhere, and sort of that worthiness really kind of can be cultivated. So whilst it's not necessarily on the surface level about the food and eating, that in itself can sometimes be enough to really shift and transform whole presentations of and lives really.
Right. Yeah, and then based on that, if it's, again, in the general form, if it falls under shame or the sense of worth, is there a pattern that evolves from that when it comes to food? Like if, for example, if I'm at a party and I feel like rejected or whatever happens, and then I start eating food to kind of numb that. Is that kind of the way it happens? Is that the cycle for a lot of people, or
Abs- yeah, absolutely for a lot of people. But what I would say to that is, the more restrictive anorexic controlling subtype, although the presentation is very different, and also in many ways, obviously the risks are very different. The pain, the underlying pain, is the same whether you're turning to food to soothe or you're turning away from food. And so I think that's an important point to make, because I think so often, depending on our own relationship, we sort of just see it from that one sort of narrow perspective, and we think those the people that are restricting. I see people who are they predominantly binge eat, and so they look at people who can restrict and are controlled, with in quite a light, in quite a an impressive view almost, oh, I wish I could do that. And ultimately it's the same. Yes, it manifests differently, but the underlying mechanism, the shame, the pain, the suffering that is being experienced, um, you know from an emotional perspective, is the same. It's just, personality type and training and conditioning and everything else that would lead people to manifest it in different ways.
right, right? And I think to your point earlier, it's never enough, right? It's never enough because whether you're restricting yourself or you're overeating, you're creating that again cycle of shame just by looking at yourself in the mirror. I know that would happen to me, so it felt like it was never enough.
It isn't, and that's because it's really not about the food and eating, and that's the point. And I think, it happens very quickly when you start really focusing on and treating this and kind of working on this. You realize that if it was about that, then the times that you were a bit thinner, or you would just be happy, and that's not what we see at all. In fact, it creates more suffering because you either have to maintain it, or you're not maintaining it, and then you feel crappy about that. So yeah, absolutely, it is never ending, and that's the really difficult and sad part when you're working with this presentation really.
Mhm. So what do you tell the clients that you work with when they're struggling with that whole body image aspect, or they have a challenging relationship with food? Obviously, to your point, it could be many things that are manifesting out in terms of how they're consuming food, or they're not consuming food. But yeah, what are you telling these people that are having that challenge and struggle, to manage that?
Well, it's really, the way that I approach this is I sort of describe it as a two-pronged approach. And I think this is where often when you try to tease apart, let's say, the physical or nutritional aspect of food and eating, from the psychological aspect, I think this is where we run into difficulties. So someone might be struggling and they might go and see, let's say, a dietitian or nutritionist, and they'll work on the physical aspects of making sure they're getting enough calories and all that kind of stuff. But then often they're neglecting, or they're not really learning how to address the emotional side of it. And then you can go sometimes and see a psychologist, psychologist, and they'll mainly focus on the emotional side of eating and the traumas and life and history and everything else, without looking at the physicality. And so the way I look at it is that these things, it has to be not only holistic, but you have to have a very deep understanding of how these things relate and interplay with each other. So the way that I work, I have to get to a point where I know the person that I'm working with is at least 70% of the time is nourishing themselves correctly. Because the problem is, and I'll give this is the example that I use. Let's say we're in a session and you told me, Romy, I binged last night. My partner came home, we had a huge argument, and I ended up just, hitting the cookies, and I couldn't stop, and I feel terrible. And that's so it would seem that the argument, there was an emotional response. The argument is what caused the leading to the binge, right? Makes sense. However, what maybe on exploration, what we realize is, well, okay, but you skipped breakfast in the morning because you don't like to eat breakfast. And then you got into work, and someone was giving out cupcakes because it was their birthday, but you decided not to have it. And it's really cold outside, but you just had your cool sandwich or a salad or something like that, when what you really needed was something warming and something filling to kind of really nourish you. And so you're already starting from a place of maybe calorie deficit. You're starting from a place of not being satiated, not nourishing yourself correctly. And then you come home and you have this argument. And yes, there was this emotional reaction, which then led to the binging, but there was also all this other stuff that had gone on before. And so what actually was the reason? Did you end up binging because of the argument, or did you end up because you're starving, or
Yeah.
you weren't satiated, or you haven't nourished yourself correctly? And so the way that I look at this, whilst I know that it's not necessarily, like I said, it's not necessarily about the food and eating um, on a global scale, we have to start there, because I have to get to a point, or you have to get to a point, where you know how to listen to your body and give it what it needs from a nourishing nutritional perspective.
Right.
And so we start with that of teaching the kind of the foundation of, how do you know when you're hungry? How do you know what foods to choose and what foods your body needs? How can you relate to that? How do you know how to eat? Like the literal mechanism of eating in a way that is mindful, that you are eating with awareness. And how do you know when to stop eating? How do you know when you're full? And how do you know not to hold all of these things as rules? And so that's, we focus very practically on it's like a training program on retraining the mind and the body to work together, and
Right.
so that you develop a trust and you start to understand that mechanism. And then what happens is, we get, so when you're doing that maybe 70% of the time, and that actually happens quite quickly. People think it doesn't, but it does. Set to get 70% actually happens quite quickly. And then, and although we talk about it all along the way, then, when you come and tell me, well, I binged last night and it was because I had this argument, I have a, yes, we'll still explore to make sure, well, what else happened during the day. But if you've been doing this a while, we have a clear understanding that this was something emotional. And then we can start looking at the emotional side of things and looking at what else is going on in your life and really exploring that. And that's when all the other techniques come into play. Um, but you have to start with that foundation, because otherwise it's very confusing. You don't really know what's causing what.
Yeah, yeah. No, thank you for sharing that example. And I guess a couple questions do come to mind that I would like to explore further. The first one being, so to your point, this person, for example, has not been nourishing themselves all day, but why is this emotional reaction triggering their need to consume more food? Like,
Oh,
what's the
so
connection there?
yeah, I mean, food ultimately is the cheapest, easiest, fastest, most legal way that you can get yourself to feel good. There's no, we eat, and all the reward centers in our brain, especially if you're eating things that are high sugar, they're literally feeding your brain with dopamine and serotonin and all the good stuff. So you're getting a reward feeling, you're getting an immediate gratification of goodness being pumped into you. So you have an argument, you're feeling crappy, you're getting that that reward system on a physiological level. And then there's also behavioral things that come into play that are being trained as a result of that. So when the mind is being flooded with that and focused on food, you're not thinking about everything else. So it's also a means of distraction. And so you're learning to use food to just completely numb out and distract yourself. And so that's the other big part of it. But and then it just becomes habitual. It's like sometimes it doesn't even work in that way. Sometimes it doesn't make you feel good, and you're not even distracting yourself, and it's just a habit pattern. And then it's, I liken it to, if you understand the brain and how neural pathways are developed, you've literally created a pathway in your brain that's what you do automatically. And so it just becomes, before you know it, your hand is in the cookie jar, or
Right.
whatever it is. You're not even aware that you're doing it anymore because it's so habitual. And so obviously part of that work is to develop that awareness and see that that's what you're doing. But the short answer to your question is, you feel better when you're eating, and it's quick and it's cheap and it's accessible, and it's legal and all the other stuff.
Right, right. And then on the alternative side, if you were to eat mindfully, like, I don't know if people, like, I see people, myself included, on most days, I'm rushing through. So, I'll quickly warm up my lunch and just, eat it because I have to get back to work. So there's not a lot of mindful eating happening there. And I'm not really even aware of the flavor, or taking the time to chew. It's just a mindless activity from that perspective. So when you talk about mindful eating, what is one supposed to do when they're mindfully eating?
Oh, that's a beautiful question. I get people to eat with me on session, and I do workshops on this as well. And perhaps a different time we could run through one of those. But essentially, my claim to you, Furkan, and to everyone else, is that probably you've never really tasted a lot of your favorite foods, because you really, when you do this, you have a very different experience. And so, the traditional way, the way that I do it is, I would take three different pieces of food, maybe like a grape, some different textures, a piece of chocolate, and like a cracker or something like that. And so you would start off, just from just as an experiential exercise. You start off, and you really take your time to look at, let's say you're looking at the grape. You really look at it. You bring it to your lips. You feel how it feels on your lips. You're undistracted. You do this in silence. You would very, very slowly put it into your mouth and not chew, and see how the textures feel, and see what's going on in your mind, what the anticipation is. Really explore the whole experience of having this grape in your mouth. And then you would start to bite down, and just bite once, and let the flavors start to come out, and see the juice. And look how long I'm taking just to describe this. And when we do
Yeah,
it, we really take our time. And so, and then you try it with the next, you slowly swallow, and then you would move on to the next piece of food. And what you start to realize is, how much you're missing from the eating experience, and how much you believe, like the amount of times, let's say, people have looked at, let's say, a piece of chocolate. And I purposely get really cheap chocolate when I do this,
yeah.
because and people, they have this anticipation of that it's going to taste really nice. And then when they really taste it, and this is often food that they're binging on all the time, when they really taste it, they report that, oh, it's got this artificial taste, or it tastes sickly sweet, or whatever it might be. And the grape, which they say, oh, I don't normally like grapes, was like a taste explosion. And so you have this completely unique experience. Now, obviously, that's done as a teaching method. I then sort of would send people away, and there are all sorts of mindfulness, or mindful eating exercises and techniques that I offer out to people. One of which would be, take your lunch, and it's called the 30-minute challenge, and try and stretch out whatever. Don't just eat continuously for 30 minutes. Take whatever you were going to be eating, and see if you can eat it over half an hour. And the reality is that no one can ever make it, because you don't realize, I mean, you said yourself, you wolf down your food, you don't realize it. But at least what happens when you do this is, you do take, because you've set this half an hour, you take the time to chew. You notice that the flavors change as you chew. You notice that you get more satiated more quickly. You notice that there are things you like that you didn't think you would like, and vice versa. And so you end up having this experience that is, it's absolutely mind-blowing, and it's so beautiful because it's always available to you, and we're missing out these opportunities. And then what happens is you get like you start, I spoke about this neural pathway, you start to develop this like enjoyment of the whole process of eating, and so then you want to do it more and more and more. We want to do things that make us feel good. And so, it happens quickly and slowly at the same time. It's like this double edged, that you sort of train in it, but then the experience is so great that you want to keep doing it. So personally, I find it impossible now to eat with any kind of music, noise, TV distraction. It's like, even sitting with my kids and family, which I do, if it was up to me, eating in silence, like really focusing on my food, the experience is beautiful. It's completely unlike how eating is experienced for most people, myself included, at times when I'm not paying attention. And so it's an art, actually, and you cultivate it, and you learn to play with it, and then you realize that actually this is a much more I almost want to say orgasmic way of eating food.
Yeah.
It's really wonderful, and so that encourages you to then want to do it more and more.
Right, right. And I mean, I don't think I've ever done it that way, that mindfully. But I do remember going to a restaurant where it was like completely dark. I'm sure you've heard about these dark
Yes.
restaurants, and you sit. And I think that was probably the closest experience I've had, because there was really no other distraction. You're sitting there in the dark and eating. Obviously, you're having a conversation with whomever you're there with, but yeah, it's interesting. And then you don't see your food either, so I find that you don't have this preconceived, I suppose, judgment or notion of what you're eating either, right? It's like a surprise in that sense. So it's
Absolutely.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And of course, that gives a really different experience in its own right. I talk a lot about how the way we see our food makes a difference, and I think it's useful to try it in both ways. I think it's useful to also appreciate how food looks, especially if it's something that is beautifully presented, because then you see it as an art form, actually. And then that increases the experience, the eating experience. But certainly, if you're exploring this, if you're wanting to try out just kind of being present with the experience of the tastes and the mechanism of eating and chewing in a way that you hadn't before, a dark room is a beautiful way of doing it, for
yeah, yeah.
sure.
And I guess, I mean, when you chew slowly and everything, I've heard like you're getting more nutrients out of it, and it's the whole process of eating that is, I guess, good for you in that
Hmm.
sense too, right? Um, and then one of the things I heard about, I can't remember where it was, but a lot of the times there's this aspect of scarcity that comes in, and people want to consume the food as quickly as possible because they feel like, I'm not going to get this opportunity again. And it's not like we're consciously thinking about it, but it's on a subconscious level. What are your thoughts on that? And what do you tell people when they have that kind of sense of, oh, the scarcity when it comes to food?
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts on that. But this is one of the biggest issues with disordered eating, especially when there's been yo-yo dieting, and or a history of diet behavior, diet mentality. Even if you're not a dieter yourself, you have that thought behavior. And I think the point to remember, so there, I have also worked with people, particularly from older generations, where scarcity was actually a real issue. So maybe they grew up in war times or in war environments, and they didn't have access to food. And although ultimately the mechanisms are a little bit the same, what I'm referring to right now is the sort of general population, where we have this idea, food is available everywhere, but we have this idea of scarcity. And more often than not, that comes from it's sort of the underlying factors are our beliefs around food, particularly around good and bad. And so where you see it the most is if people have these rules of, I shouldn't be eating this, and so then when they do allow themselves to eat it, they end up overeating or binge eating on it. But it's more from a place of fear of, like, I don't know when I'm going to get this again. Like, this is bad. I shouldn't be eating these French fries, and so now I'm going to eat as many as I possibly can. And or they have chocolate come in from for the holidays, and then everyone, it's over, and now you want to eat it all up to get it finished, and that there's an element of that that comes into play. And so part of the work is really, when I spoke about the trust before, a big part of the work is on the eating what you want, allowing yourself to eat these foods at the beginning whenever you want them, at any point. And there are certain methods we use. For example, we use, it's called stocking up, where you basically have so much of, let's say your big binge food is, I've had someone with peanut butter, and so you would literally have 20 jars, so that even in your biggest binge, there's no way you could physically get through all of those. You might try, but you wouldn't be able to.
Right.
And I've done this work, and people, they'll go through, they end up going through a lot of peanut butter. But what happens is, in doing that, and if you trust the process, and you continuously, just every time I feel like peanut butter, I'm going to have the peanut butter, then within, depending on a few factors, within quite quickly, a short amount of time, people end up exhausting that, and then they realize, oh, peanut butter is really here whenever I want it. And so then you don't have that sort of that sort of scarcity, that's like, I have to eat it all now
Right.
experience, because your body has trusted, oh, peanut butter really will be here whenever I want it to be here. And what ends up happening is, I had a client come in, and we did this with a number of foods, and then she came in, she was like, yep, me and peanut butter have had a falling out. And she never would have believed it, in a million
Right.
years she wouldn't have believed it, but it happened. And we did it with cheese, we did it with cornflakes, all of her sort of bingy foods. And slowly she got it. She was like, okay, now I understand that this is how I have to approach it.
No, that's interesting, and I guess it leads me to probably the most obvious question. Then, maybe not so obvious, but there's this whole idea of cheat days that people have. Right? They'll work hard all week, and then one day of the week, or maybe it's the weekend. A lot of people have this tendency. I think I have it too, to a certain extent, where maybe on a Saturday I'll be like, oh, you know what, I'll let myself go a little bit and eat. And I think sometimes that drives the scarcity too, where it's like, well, I'm not going to do this all week, so I might as well get it all in. What are your thoughts around cheat days then, from that perspective? Do you believe that's something that people should have, or they, to your point earlier, should eat whatever they feel like eating, and in the right amount of quantity?
Yeah, 100% the latter. I mean, I think that cheat days, it's essentially diet mentality, and I think I want to, I think this is a really good point, to bring up more generally, which is that there is, diets now have been replaced. That it's not trendy anymore to
Hmm.
diet, right? It's all
Right.
about clean eating, healthy eating, all this stuff. And us, from the professional perspective, what we understand is that it's just been repackaged in a different
Hmm.
way. And
Yeah.
so, now we talk about these cheat days, and all this kind of stuff. And you know what I want to say about this is that I don't inherently think there is a problem with certain systems. So if people ask me, for example, all about intermittent fasting,
Yeah.
and my ultimate take on that is, I don't believe that intermittent fasting, for example, is fundamentally flawed. My issue is that if you have a disordered relationship with food, eating, and your body, then that is just another mechanism to play that out. You're
Right.
not doing it. It's not a health-based response. Whatever people say, that's not what you're doing. It's coming from a place of fear. You're fearful of gaining weight, or of your body not being desirable, or not looking, in accordance to a socially construed idea of desirability.
Hmm.
And so, out of that fear, you're clutching onto all these mechanisms or these methods to try and control that. At this point now, I've been doing this so many years. I do all sorts of crazy stuff. I go
Yeah.
into meditation, long meditations, and I do all sorts of crazy things with my food. But I have a completely, really loving, beautiful relationship with food, eating, and my body. So,
Hmm.
where I kind of have an issue with this is, if I say to people that are starting out, or if they do have a disordered relationship and they are noticing these behaviors of binge eating and everything else, let's deal with that first. Like, drop all of the cheat days, and the dieting, and the health, and the so-called healthy eating, and
Yeah.
everything else, and let's work on your relationship with food and eating in your body. When you're sweet with that, you can do whatever you want, but let's start with this. Let's start with working on that. And yes, to your point, in under those circumstances, all a cheat day is a way for you. A the permission to binge. That's all it
Right.
is. It's a permission to binge, to feel crap about yourself, and to then make yourself feel a bit better by saying, well, I'm not going to do it for the rest of the week. And then, what if you get to Wednesday and it's not a cheat day and you want a packet of crisps or something?
Right.
It's like it doesn't make sense to live your life that way. You're just stripping all joy. And like going back to the point of mindful eating, if you understand how beautiful this experience is, why would you want to live your life that way?
Right. Well, I guess the argument I've heard, and I can see some truth to it, but I'll put it out there is a lot of people, and I think that's how I justified it myself too. Is like, I'm gonna be disciplined all week, but then my reward is this one day where I can eat whatever I want. And to me, it wasn't like, oh, it's for free for all. It's just kind of being less regimented with what I'm eating, right? If it's
Okay.
like, okay, if I want to have popcorn or if I want to have a piece of chocolate, sure, I can allow myself that. And it would act as a reward.
So my question to you is, do you want food to have that kind of power over you? Because I can have popcorn whenever I want, and I can have chocolate whenever I want, and I'll just put it out there. I'm quite small. I'm not, I don't weigh very too much, and I have a really healthy, natural relationship with food, and I probably eat chocolate every day. And it's not, I know people will come and say, well, that's naturally the way you are. No, not true. I mean, I've never been considered sort of completely overweight, but I was probably 20 pounds heavier as growing up when I didn't have a good relationship with food and eating in this way, and I wasn't aware of it. And that's ultimately what the research shows as well. If you look at the research of people who naturally know how to listen to their body and intuitively eat, they tend to be lighter. So even from a scientific perspective, it doesn't. What I understand, this desire to want to control it and to feel that, well, I have the reward and I have to be disciplined, but that's actually, it's paradoxically not the way that the body works, and it has a lot to do with the brain. There's actually systems in the hypothalamus that get activated when you eat in that way, and it kind of causes you to actually hold on to the weight more. So I mean, it's a slightly more deeper exploration to talk about this, but
Yeah, yeah, no, thanks for breaking that down too, and I guess along the same lines that there's all these kinds of diets out there, right? And I have friends who are like, oh, you should go vegetarian completely, and I have friends that were like, no, you should only eat meat, and I've experimented with both and other diets too. I do intermittent fasting as well, and I feel like I found an optimum spot where I feel alert, I feel good throughout the day. I don't feel like I have any challenges with energy levels. So I think I found a sweet spot where, I have enough vegetables and enough meat in my diet. But I think people stick to a diet because it's trendy or it feels right based
mm,
on the messaging they're receiving, but it may not necessarily fit with their body type. And I think there's a cultural aspect to it as well, especially depending on where your family origins are from. That's what I believe. But yeah, I just wanted to test that with you as well.
yes, spot on. I remember a number of years ago, I was in South Africa, and I was seeing an older client. He was in his probably late 60s, early 70s, and he was a small, skinny guy. We actually weren't focusing on food and eating, but we were talking about other stuff. But this came up, and he said, everyone had told him that he needed to stop eating bread. That was the thing in South Africa amongst that generation at that time. Everyone, he shouldn't be eating bread. And so he said, so I stopped eating bread, and I felt absolutely awful. I literally felt terrible. And I said to him, so you should go back and eat bread. And he was like, oh, you mean I have permission to do it? And I think this is the point. The way that I work is really all about empowering the people that I'm working with to understand that no one knows their body the way that they do.
Right.
And the analogy that I always give, and I'd really like to offer this out, it's like if I were to tell you, Furkan, there's this new approach, but you have to listen to me about when to go to the toilet, about, what you have to do when you have to do what I tell you when I tell you to do it, and you're not allowed to do it outside of those times. I think you probably wouldn't go ahead with it, right?
Probably
No,
not.
probably not. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, and so when I ask you, but how do you know when you need to go to the toilet? What's your answer?
Well, my body tells me.
Okay, beautiful. So that's the same with food and eating.
Yeah.
And that's what I really want. If anyone, if people listening can take one thing, it's like empower yourself. No, it doesn't matter what it works for a billion other people out there. If it doesn't work for you, don't keep doing it. It's all one thing to experiment. I'm really all for experimenting and for trying out different things and for finding, as you say, finding your sweet spot. Providing, I think you need some honesty with that. So you need to know that your sweet spot isn't just, oh, I look really skinny, so even though I feel like crap. I think that's an important consideration, because most people stop with that. As long as I look a certain way, I'm happy with it. But if you take that out of the equation, if you're feeling really good, your energy levels are good, you're feeling good in yourself, you feel like you're nourished, all the rest, then that's beautiful. Then you found your sweet spot. But if you're doing something, as you say, because it's trendy, because someone else tells you to, because even a professional, I mean, doctors, other professionals, they say stuff all the time of what you should be doing. And it's like, your body knows exactly what it needs. Trust that. Work on building that trust up. If you're not sure, then go out and get some help on how to learn it. It's actually really easy to do. It doesn't take very long even. Um, and you will build up that trust, and you'll learn how to navigate and listen to your body in a way that feels really, really good. And then you won't ever, once you have that experience, you won't ever be blown by someone else's opinion again, because you'll know what works for you.
Right. And yeah, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. I agree with you. I think that's kind of the journey I've gone on. I've experimented and I still continue to experiment, because if there's ways to improve things and make myself feel better, I'm all for finding those out. I don't limit myself to any one way. I think there's, if a new idea comes forward, if someone shares something, I'll be like, oh, let me try it out. And if it doesn't work, then I go back. Or if it does, then I build it into my routine. So it's so important to try things out and listen to your body. And I think to your point earlier, there's that holistic aspect to it too, right? I feel like when we restrict ourselves based on what we hear or what we think should be the way to do things, it creates psychologically a lot of things too, right? Like for people, it can manifest as anxiety or depression for that matter, because they feel like they're following this diet that's solved a lot of issues for other people, but they're not feeling like it's doing it for them. So there's a lot of stuff that can come up even from that, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wouldn't, I mean, you're spot on in that respect, but it's not even as necessarily as extreme, I would say, as looking at it from, clinically how it might manifest. I think this is what I meant when I said as a gateway. I think if you understand, oh, I'm just following X, Y, and Z because that's what I'm being told to do. Where else are you doing that in your life? Are you doing that in your relationships? Are you doing that in your workplace? Are you doing that with where you physically live? Are you doing that in how your whole life is cultivated? And this is what I really meant. And I appreciate you bringing it up, because this is what I really meant when I said it's this gateway, because you're eating every day. So you might as well learn from it, right? It's literally, information that is there for you to analyze and to learn about yourself. It's just being given for free, and you have plenty of opportunities to work with it. And so if you get that and you understand that, you start to see, like, even the fact that I often have people that they just don't even know what they want to eat. Now, does that play out in your life, that you don't even know? You don't know what it is that you really want. I see it plays out in sexual experiences, that they're not able to own that. It plays out in relationships. They're not able to say what they really need. They don't know what they really need. They're doing jobs that aren't really fitting for them because they don't have that empowerment, but also that insight into themselves to be able to start to explore it. So it's a really, really good way of seeing where you're stuck. actually. And yes, if you're not doing that, then of course that can lead, and it does lead to all sorts of other manifestations and things coming up.
Right, right. Yeah. No, that's very important. Last question to end things off, because I know you were talking about meditation as well, and I think I believe this to be true. But do you believe like our relationship with food and what we eat can have a spiritual influence as well in our life?
Oh, without a doubt. Literally, I mean, without a doubt. Even just thinking from my own personal practice, like I said, when I go into deep retreats, or on my own solitary retreats for extended periods of time, um, not only does what my body crave want, but the amount that you need is very, very, very different. Your relationship to food is very different. How I see food is exceptionally different. Even with all of the other stuff that I'd done before, it just continuously changes, and there's so much. Like there's so much sacredness around food and eating and the sustenance of life and the opportunity. I mean, the opportunity that eating gives us. So I think it's a very, very important question, but it's huge. And yes, I definitely think there is a very, very strong relationship, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, that's great. Thank you. Now, I mean, as we come to an end, is there, I know we've covered a lot, but is there anything you feel that's relevant for listeners to take home? I know you talked about listening to your body, which is probably the most important thing, but is there anything else that you feel we can add before we come to an end here?
Well, I think to sort of just further play on your final point, I would say that I think a solid lineage based meditation practice with instruction from a teacher, from a master,
Yeah,
I think can do absolute wonders with exploring this whole domain. Obviously not just food and eating, but that as well. And I think by now I'm at the point where I everyone that I work with, I will integrate some form of a meditative practice into their kind of homework tasks, and into this endeavor, because I think ultimately it's very, very difficult, just on the most basic level. It's very difficult to catch the identities that play out, the behaviors that play out, the automatic behaviors, of the hand go. It's very difficult to catch that without holding some kind of mindful attention. And that's something that is, concentration. And just to go off on a tangent, people
yeah,
come to me all the time and say they have diagnoses of ADHD. It's like concentration is, it's like a muscle. It can be cultivated and built. And you need concentration when you're doing any kind of work on yourself. You have to be able to concentrate, to remember the instructions, to remember what it is that you're trying to work on, to be able to catch yourself doing it. You have to have your concentration there, and not be kind of blown away by a million different things.
right.
And so that needs to be cultivated. And so it really works very well when you're doing any kind of work, not just food, eating, and body, but any kind of personal development or self growth work. It's, I think, actually essential to also have some form of a meditative practice. And the reason I said to kind of go with a teacher is because I think that it's not always that easy to get the right instructions, even though there's so much out there. And again, that's another big topic. But I think, just to say, I think having good instruction to learn how to actually meditate in a way that is going to support everything else that you're doing is super important.
Yeah, yeah. So I lied when I said last question. I do have one
Okay,
came up. And this one should be a quick one, hopefully.
sure.
Do you feel like we overconsume food in general, like in today's world?
D- Yes, I do feel that we do. Yes, is the short answer. But I think it's more complex than just we're
Yeah,
we're just consuming too much. I think there's so many factors. There's socioeconomic factors. There's the access factors. There's our lack of understanding that leads to that. There's a lack of understanding also about nutrition and what the body needs. There's access, and then most importantly, there's our own relationship to food and eating that is just completely out of control, I think, or that we don't have that awareness of.
yeah, yeah. I feel that too. But thank you for doing this. Thank you for coming on here. For listeners that do want to get a hold of you and learn more about the work you do, what are some ways they can do that?
Yeah, you can go on my website. It's drromiran.com. So just doctor and Romi, my name, Romi, Ran, Ran. You can follow me on Instagram. My handle is at Dr. Romi Ran. Those are probably the main ways, and then all the other. Just Google my name and you'll get all the rest. But I would say if you want to, hear any more content, I'm putting snippets on Instagram often, and then my website kind of gives a deeper sort of explanation of who I am, what my experience, that sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's great. I'll put that in the show notes. Thank you again. I
Thank
feel
you.
like there's quite a bit we still could have covered, so maybe more to come. But I appreciate everything you shared, and I gained a lot from this. I hope I'm sure the listeners will as well. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Becca. Great to speak with you.